What happens to your wife after divorce? You know what nobody tells you about divorce? It rarely happens in an explosion. It fades in silence. Clara didn't storm out of her marriage. She simply drifted, one small disconnection at a time, until one morning she packed her things and called it freedom. Elias remembers that day like a photograph you can't stop staring at, too still, too clean, like the world forgot to breathe. She told him she needed to find herself, but he knew what that really meant. She was chasing the version of herself that the world kept promising her, the woman who glowed under her own light, unburdened, unstoppable. What Clara didn't see was that this kind of freedom comes with an invisible tax, the collapse of certainty. No one warns you how brutal it is to trade the known for the imagined. At first, she felt euphoric. It was as if she'd stepped out of gravity. She painted her new apartment white, filled it with plants and silence, started posting quotes about new beginnings. Every post got hundreds of likes, and for a moment, that digital applause felt like oxygen. But underneath, the dissonance had already begun, because for years, her mind had been wired around Elias, the way he laughed from the kitchen, the sound of his keys on the table, the predictable rhythm of shared life. Every neural pathway had his name carved into it, and when she walked away, she didn't just leave him, she left the architecture of her own mind. Elias would scroll through her new life from time to time, the filtered smiles, the bright captions, the careful performance of joy. Everyone was congratulating her for being brave. But bravery isn't the same as peace. What people don't see is the emotional physics behind these transformations. For every public declaration of independence, there's an equal and opposite private collapse. The truth is, divorce doesn't hit like thunder. It leaks in slowly, like water through the ceiling, invisible until everything underneath starts to rot. Clara thought she had escaped something: mediocrity, routine, the slow death of affection, but she had only stepped into a different kind of emptiness, one that looked prettier at first glance. Freedom, she would later learn, has its own kind of cage. It just doesn't have walls, it has mirrors. And in those mirrors, every reflection looked slightly off, like she was still searching for the person she swore she'd find once she left. In those early weeks, she mistook momentum for meaning. New furniture, new routines, new mantras. But the silence at night was heavy. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the silence of an echo chamber, one where every thought sounded like a question she didn't want to answer. That's the part no one tells you. Divorce doesn't start when you sign papers. It starts when you realize the echo you hear in your own apartment isn't the room, it's your own voice, trying to convince itself it's okay. For a while, Clara convinced herself that she had never felt more alive. Every morning, sunlight spilled across her bed sheets like a blessing, and she took it as proof that she had made the right choice. She started jogging at dawn, drinking green smoothies, lighting candles that smelled like eucalyptus and self-acceptance. Her friends clapped for her new beginnings. You're glowing, you're radiant, you're finally free. Each word landed like a small injection of dopamine. This was the honeymoon with herself phase, that dangerous intersection between genuine hope and curated illusion. Clara became her own marketing team, building an identity out of affirmations. She filled her days with activity, yoga classes, dinner with friends, new hobbies that looked great on Instagram. She didn't realize that she was feeding a machine, not her soul. The more she performed freedom, the more she needed to perform it again tomorrow. Social media became her confessional. Every post, a sermon of empowerment, every selfie, a silent plea for validation. Neuroscientists would call it the dopamine loop. Post, reward, repeat. But Clara didn't care about science. She was too busy sculpting her rebirth. In truth, it wasn't rebirth. It was a simulation of happiness. She was high on her own decision, and every high comes with a crash. Elias watched from a distance, not out of bitterness but fascination, the way people watch slow-motion footage of a wave forming before it breaks. He knew this stage. He had seen it before in others, and maybe even in himself. That desperate need to prove to the world and to yourself that the pain was worth it. But the thing about illusions is they require constant maintenance. The house she redecorated looked beautiful, but it was still built on the same foundation of avoidance. The quiet moments brushing her teeth, waiting for a text, scrolling through endless faces on dating apps, began to hum with an unspoken question. Why doesn't this feel like peace? She told herself she was evolving, that the ache she felt at night was just growing pains. But what she didn't realize was that she wasn't growing, she was floating, unanchored. Her identity was no longer tethered to anyone or anything, and that weightlessness began to feel less like freedom and more like vertigo. By the third month, Clara had mastered the art of distraction. Every hour filled, every silence muted. She had no idea that her brain was beginning to adapt, not to joy, but to numbness. Because that's what happens when you feed yourself novelty instead of nourishment. You start confusing stimulation for meaning. In her journal, she wrote, "I've never felt more myself." But if she had read between her own lines, she might have seen the truth that every word was written not from discovery, but from defense. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. The illusion began to crumble the way glass fogs slowly, invisibly, until one day you realize you can't see through it anymore. Clara's first real date since the divorce was the beginning. The man's name was Adrian, tall, self-assured, good job, good taste, the kind of man who seemed like an answer. Over dinner, he laughed at all the right moments, complimented her perfume, said she had depth, a word that made her chest flutter. But later that night, when he kissed her goodbye, she felt nothing, not revulsion, not desire, just emptiness wrapped in politeness. And that silence between them, that absence of warmth, grew heavier than any argument she ever had with Elias. For the first time, she realized this man didn't know her. Not really. He didn't know the way she turned the radio down during thunderstorms. He didn't know how she used to leave notes on mirrors when she was happy. He didn't even know that she always double-checked the locks before bed. To him, she was just a Friday night. A pleasant story to pass the time. Still, she pushed through. Admitting doubt now would mean admitting she might have been wrong, and her pride was built on the idea that she had escaped something suffocating. So she went on more dates, smiled more, laughed louder. But the laughter started to feel staged, like an actor repeating a line that's lost its meaning. She began to notice things, how men talked about their exes with rehearsed indifference, how quickly they reached across the table, how rarely they listened. She told herself she was being too critical, too nostalgic, but her subconscious had already begun its cruel comparison engine. It started matching patterns, tone of voice, small gestures, the way one man tapped his fingers impatiently when she spoke. Elias never did that. Another one talked about emotional independence, but flinched when she mentioned children. Another wore the same cologne Elias once did, and it hit her like a ghost passing through. Every interaction chipped away at the fantasy. The compliments began to sound hollow, the attention transactional. The novelty that once felt intoxicating now felt industrial efficient, repetitive, cold. Elias had once said that love isn't about excitement, it's about recognition. She hadn't understood then, but now the truth was sinking in. These men didn't recognize her. How could they? She barely recognized herself. In the quiet after another disappointing evening, Clara scrolled through her messages, dozens of names, empty threads, half-hearted conversations. For the first time, she saw it clearly. She wasn't being desired. She was being consumed. And the market never stops consuming. The first crack in her story had appeared. And once a story cracks, it can never be told the same way again. By the 6th month, the glow was gone. The world that once felt open and infinite began to shrink around Clara, room by room, screen by screen. Her phone, once alive with validation, now sat quiet on the counter. Friends who once toasted her courage had moved on to their own dramas. The "you're glowing" texts stopped. The yoga mat gathered dust. And at night, when the city's hum faded, the silence started to sound like accusation. This was the panic season, not the wild, flailing kind, but the quiet kind that seeps under the door and fills every room before you even notice. Clara woke up one morning and realized she didn't have anyone to make coffee for. No messages to check, no routine that required her. Freedom had turned into absence, and absence had begun to feel like punishment. She tried to outrun it. More outings, more self-improvement plans, more dates with men whose faces blurred together. But the thrill of attention had dulled into something mechanical, like a vending machine of temporary comfort. Her friends didn't say it out loud, but she saw it in their eyes: fatigue. They were tired of hearing about her new chapter. The ones who were married began to drift away, subtly protective of their own stability. The single ones, once her partners in liberation, had become competitors in an invisible economy of attention. Her kids, when they were with her, had started acting out. Little rebellions, small storms. At first, she thought it was normal, adjustment. But one night, after another argument over nothing, her daughter said softly, "You're different now." It was the kind of sentence that cuts so deep you can't find where it entered. That night, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling. Her mind replayed all the mantras she'd whispered to herself over the months. You're strong, you're free, you're finally happy. But none of them landed anymore. They bounced off the walls like dull echoes. Psychologists call it emotional dissonance, the gap between how your life looks and how it feels. And that gap had widened so much, it could swallow her whole. She started to understand that what she'd built wasn't happiness. It was a performance of resilience. Elias, meanwhile, had entered his own kind of stillness. No longer angry, no longer mourning, just quietly rebuilding. He didn't know she sometimes checked his page, late at night, watching him laugh with friends, noticing how his eyes looked lighter. Every smile of his now seemed to prove a theory she'd been avoiding. Maybe it wasn't him who was broken. Maybe it was her idea of freedom that was. The panic wasn't loud. It was subtle, creeping, sophisticated. The kind that makes your own reflection look like a stranger's. And every day, she felt a little less like the woman who had once sworn she'd never look back. Around the 1-year mark, something inside Clara finally gave way. It didn't shatter, it collapsed quietly, like a structure that had been hollowed out for too long. She had been living in motion, afraid to stop, afraid that stillness might reveal the truth. And when she finally stopped, the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like exposure. The reckoning always arrives disguised as an ordinary day. No crisis, no big event, just the slow awareness that you're no longer the protagonist of the story you told yourself. Clara sat by the window one evening, watching rain smear against the glass, and realized she had nowhere to be, no one to text, no reason to check her reflection. The phone buzzed once, an old friend cancelling dinner, and then it was quiet again. That was when it hit her. This is my life now, empty but curated. Her mind, which once revolved around a we, was now orbiting nothing. The brain doesn't rewire easily. It keeps searching for familiar patterns, for voices it used to synchronize with. That's why she still caught herself reaching for her phone to message Elias when something funny happened. Why she still thought of him when locking the door at night. It wasn't nostalgia, it was neurology. Years of shared rhythm can't be deleted like files. She tried to meditate, to write, to read self-help books that promised transcendence. But beneath all the advice, heal yourself, trust the journey, you are enough, there was an unspoken truth. Healing doesn't happen in isolation. The human brain was never designed for total independence. It needs reflection, resonance, and touch. And Clara had severed all three. The loneliness became physical, the kind that sinks into muscle memory. She found herself craving the smallest gestures, someone brushing past her in the kitchen, a hand resting on her shoulder, a familiar breath beside her in bed. Not sex, just contact, presence. It was only then she understood how marriage isn't just emotional, it's biological, a shared nervous system, and hers had gone offline. One Sunday night, the weight of it all finally broke through. She poured herself a glass of wine, then another, then stared at the ceiling until the tears came slow, soundless, exhausted. In the dark, she whispered, "I thought I wanted freedom," but what she really wanted was to stop feeling invisible. Meanwhile, Elias was becoming someone else, steadier, clearer, quieter, the version of himself that pain had forced him to meet. He had begun to understand things about their marriage that he couldn't see before, and ironically, so had she. The tragedy wasn't that they lost each other, it was that she only began to see his value once he existed beyond her reach. That's the cruel symmetry of the reckoning. It doesn't punish you, it reveals you. If the reckoning was the collapse, then the aftermath was the drought. Clara's world had thinned out to bare outlines, people, plans, and places all drifting beyond reach. Her once busy calendar sat blank. The group chats she used to light up had grown quiet, her name replaced by emojis and silence. Freedom, once so loud, had become isolation, wearing good perfume. Her married friends stopped calling as often. It wasn't cruelty, it was self-preservation. She was now a living reminder that stability could vanish, that marriage could crumble from the inside out. When they met for coffee, Conversations were polite but tense, like everyone was avoiding the same invisible subject. Their husbands didn't join anymore. The invitations to couple dinners, to birthday trips, they evaporated. She told herself she didn't care. But when the photos appeared online, a small ache bloomed anyway. Her single friends were no refuge either. At first, they had celebrated her return to the wild. But over time, a quiet competition replaced camaraderie. Everyone was fishing in the same shrinking pond. The app men, the almost divorced, the emotionally unavailable. The energy shifted from sisterhood to survival. Friendship became conditional. Who's dating? Who's glowing? Who's still thriving? Clara wasn't thriving anymore, and in a culture obsessed with winning, she had no role left to play. Dating apps became her desert, endless mirages of connection that disappeared on contact. At first, she'd felt a pulse of validation every time her phone lit up. Now it only triggered fatigue. The same faces recycled, the same empty conversations about travel, food, ambition. Each match was a flicker of hope that quickly went out. The illusion of abundance only deepened her sense of scarcity. The cruel math of modern dating had revealed itself. She was competing with versions of women she could no longer become younger, freer, unscarred by history. The algorithms knew it before she did. Her profile impressions dropped, her messages slowed. She felt it like a slow fade into digital invisibility. At night, she scrolled past photos of perfect strangers, all smiling beneath captions about self-love and independence. It was like looking into a hall of mirrors, every reflection promising fulfillment, every reflection hollow. She caught herself wondering if Elias was dating. When she saw a tagged photo of him at a dinner with friends laughing, relaxed, her chest tightened in that peculiar mix of grief and admiration. He looked alive. Not performative, not escaping, just there. That's when it struck her. Maybe the real desert wasn't social at all. Maybe it was internal, the barren space left behind when you spend too long mistaking attention for affection, performance for purpose. She turned off her phone and sat in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of her apartment. For the first time, she didn't reach for distraction. She just sat in it, the vast, echoing absence of everything she thought she wanted. It happened years later, not with a breakdown, but with a stillness that felt almost sacred. Clara saw Elias again by accident. It was a Sunday afternoon at a park, the kind of day that seems to belong to families. He was sitting under a tree, laughing with a woman who carried herself with calm certainty, not the frantic glow of someone trying to prove happiness. Their children, his and hers, played nearby, weaving laughter through the air. Clara stood frozen for a moment, as if the scene were happening behind glass. It wasn't jealousy that rose inside her, it was recognition. She was watching the life she once had, the one she traded for something shinier, emptier, louder. And the realization arrived not as anger, but as grief, because what she saw wasn't a replacement of her. It was a restoration of him. Elias hadn't just moved on. He had grown into the man she once begged him to become. And the bitter truth, he had become that man because she left. Psychologists call it retrospective clarity. You don't see the truth in the fire, you see it in the ashes. Clara finally understood that she hadn't left Elias because he wasn't enough. She left because she believed she deserved more. But more had no definition. It was a mirage built from comparison and noise, the constant hum of a culture that tells you happiness is always somewhere else. The weight of that understanding was almost biblical. She thought about the long nights she'd spent scrolling through faces, searching for connection in algorithms. The affirmations, the reinventions, the curated confidence, all of it had been armor, not healing. What she had wanted wasn't liberation, it was reassurance. What she needed wasn't novelty, it was meaning. She walked past him quietly that day, unnoticed. But as she did, she caught a faint echo of his laughter, and it carried a peace she had never managed to fabricate. For a brief second, she saw herself through his eyes, the woman she used to be before the noise, and she realized she didn't need to be punished. She already was. Freedom had delivered everything it promised, except fulfillment. Independence had given her space, but no ground to stand on. And all the while, time, that quiet, impartial judge, had turned her illusions into mirrors. In every reflection, she no longer saw a victim or a heroine, just a human being who mistook movement for growth, validation for love, and self-discovery for escape. That night, She went home and deleted her dating apps, closed her social media, sat by the window and watched the lights go out across the city. For the first time, there was no story to tell, no image to maintain, just silence, and something that resembled honesty. In the end, Clara didn't hate herself, or Elias, or even the choices that led her here. She simply understood. And understanding, though it came too late to save the marriage, was perhaps the truest kind of freedom she had ever found.